Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced, subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world are overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice and dig into the nuts and bolts of their values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and how they build power. This week on Rising Up for Justice, my guest is TaraRaghuveer, director and founder of the Tenant Union Federation. The Tenant Union Federation is a union of unions, organizing tenants to wield power at a massive scale, as well as KC Tenants, the citywide tenant union in Kansas City, Missouri. Tara has been organizing with tenants for more than a decade. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
So what does it mean to have a union of unions, especially when it comes to tenants? We usually think of unions as being something that organizes workers, not rent payers.
So tenant unions are actually an age-old arrangement. We're not inventing anything here, but what we're doing with the Tenant Union Federation is trying to understand and refine a practice of organizing tenants that can maximize tenants' political and economic leverage and their power. So much like a job site, much like a shop floor, tenants could exercise a lot of power in the places where they live if they're connected. There's latent power that exists in our homes, in the properties in which we live, in the trailer parks in which some of us live. But that power is only something that's available to us to exercise if we get organized. So increasingly, we're borrowing tactics from organized labor to think about organizing tenants at home in similar ways to how workers are organized on their jobs. And specifically what that means to us is we're trying to organize what we call supermajority strike-ready unions. So when we organize in a property, we're trying to get at least a majority, 50% or more of the tenants signed on with the union. And actually what we're aiming for is supermajority, so even more than that. And strike ready, meaning these are fighting unions. They're not kind of bureaucratic structures that are just working with individuals to solve their grievances or to address their individual issues, but rather fighting unions that are ready to exercise tenants' political and economic power. In our case, that's usually our rent. So if our demands aren't met, we got to be ready to exercise our rent power and all of the other power that's available to us in order to make sure that our demands are met and that ultimately we win.
So is this a model that's relatively new, or is it, I mean, you mentioned that it's been around for a while, but has it been refined over the years to sort of understand, well, this has worked, and so this is what we can do better? I mentioned the Kansas City, Missouri a project that you've been involved in. Was that a model for expansion nationally?
Right. We see ourselves as refining a long-standing tradition. Tenants have been organizing across generations, through time, across the world, and in many instances, tenant organizing is not so much more complicated than just connecting with neighbors. The difference is really in recognizing the latent power of that connection and trying to use it to maximum effect. I do think in the contemporary era, our challenge is increasing because the powers that we're up against have more consolidated and greater power than ever before. So real estate capital is hyper-organized, and landlords have gotten bigger and their power more consolidated. There is much more power that exists across state lines among our landlords, and their identities are more obscured to us than ever before. So we're up against some new and some different forces, and the forces that we're up against have perhaps more power than they've ever had. So in some ways, our organizing needs to change in order to respond to that. And that's part of what we're experimenting with right now. We're trying to think about more different ways we can organize, for example, across whole portfolios owned by the same landlord. Last year, we were part of a national effort to organize one landlord's portfolio across the country. Is one of the first examples in recent history of tenants organizing at that scale across state lines to try to take on a powerful landlord that's not really regulatable at the local or state level, but is one that we could potentially take on if we can organize enough power across their portfolio.
How much of this has to do with, and how much of your work is in response to the fact that our model for housing, for especially rental housing, is completely broken, and that it's something that's gotten worse over the time? I mean, it seems bizarre that you would have a single corporate landlord, hundreds of miles away, controlling and owning, setting rents for tenants that they're so far removed from. Is that a failure, complete failure of contemporary housing policy?
The housing market is a catastrophic failure, and in many ways, this is by design. The market is not some passive product. It is, of course, something that has been constructed by the people and institutions who profit from it. The rent is too damn high. It has been too damn high for a long time, and increasingly, something has got to give. So, what we keep saying is that the question is not whether tenants will revolt. The question is whether that revolt will be from a place of desperation or from a place of power. And exactly to your point, Sonali, what we're trying to do is ensure the latter. We have to ensure, we have no other choice but to ensure that tenants are responding from a place of power, which requires organization, and it requires more, better, and more powerful organization than we've ever had before.
So, given that this is a union of unions, I am assuming that your goal is for places all over the country where tenants are struggling to get organized locally, form a union based on, the model that you're suggesting and putting forth, and then join in this national federation. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. Some of it starts with tenants organizing where they live in their properties, across neighborhoods, across their cities. And then what we're trying to do as quickly and at a level of scale, at a large, what we're trying to do as quickly as possible and at a level of scale that hasn't been seen before is organize tenants into this kind of national formation from a place of shared analysis and commitment and methodological practice. Because the other piece of this that we know is that even if we organize building by building, block by block, and it's the strongest possible organizing, that still doesn't compete with the kind of pace and scale of real estate capital as it exists today. So we have to be building something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. And that's where the Tenant Union Federation comes in. And that's also where some of these kind of larger scale strategic swings come in, like the portfolio-based organizing, because it's not enough. It won't suffice actually just to tell people to organize where they live. We also need to be doing so in a way that's connected and can leverage into something much bigger than any of our individual properties.
Do you recruit tenant groups, or do you wait for sort of grassroots bottom-up organizing, or is it a combination of both in terms of growing the number of tenant unions around the country?
Yeah, it's everything. I don't think we have the luxury of waiting for people to present themselves to us or to I don't think we have the luxury of waiting at all. So some of it is meeting people where they're at. People approach us and find us and get trained by us through things like our union school training. And then sometimes we need to proactively recruit people into the fights that we've decided to pick. So, we recruited some individuals and unions into the campaign that we ran against Capital Realty Group last year. And that proactive strategy is also important because we need to sort of prioritize getting to scale and some strategic interventions in geographies and portfolios that we need in order to build the kind of power that we want.
You mentioned union school training. What is that?
Last summer, we ran a 3-month intensive called Union School. It's a skills-based training that teaches our STEPS methodology, the steps to build supermajority strike-ready unions. A weekly training, virtual. We trained almost 400 tenant unionists across the country in everywhere from Boise to Albany, Memphis to Missoula, places in between. It is a really intensive training where tenants receive assignments on a weekly basis that they have to fulfill before the next week. And those assignments are all related to organizing their properties. And excitingly, I think by the end of the training, we had recruited thousands of new tenants into this type of powerful formation. And a good half dozen of those unions ended up at the bargaining table with their landlords within a month or a couple months of taking the training. And we're hoping to run this training again this summer and make it even bigger. It would be amazing to double or triple, quadruple the size of this training. I think the hunger's there, and we feel a responsibility to meet that hunger with the largest possible training that covers as much ground as we can.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you face in doing this organizing? I mean, from an outsider's perspective, the first thing that jumps out at me is that often tenants who are struggling to pay rent are the same ones who are struggling to have the time to organize. They might be working a couple of jobs. They might be parents who are also having to figure out how to pay for childcare, etc. Is that one of your biggest challenges?
Absolutely. One of the biggest challenges of tenant organizing is that capital keeps us moving. It's extremely hard to organize the poorest and most vulnerable tenants because of the financial constraints on their lives. Many people are working 3, sometimes 4 jobs in order to make the rent these days. That does not leave them with a lot of time to come to a tenant meeting, to run a card drive in their property, to get their neighbor signed on to the union. So that's a huge struggle. And another struggle that's related is not just building power, but maintaining power, holding that power over time. It's really difficult to maintain union leadership when landlords can evict people, and they often do, and people move because of the poor conditions of their homes, and we can't blame them for that. But the sort of endurance of the power that we build is difficult to maintain, and there's some uniqueness in our organizing that is distinct from labor union organizing, and there's uniqueness to the conditions that poor tenants face that we have to be really thoughtful about when we're doing the organizing work that we do.
Now, in terms of actually spreading the word about unions, a union of tenants, what's the sort of storytelling work that you have to engage in? Because I imagine that this isn't an issue that gets covered in our corporate media very much. Maybe the housing crisis does get covered, but not that people are necessarily organizing and the innovative ways in which they're organizing. How do you do the cultural work of organizing?
An important practice for us is telling truthful stories about victories. So, it may have been inconceivable to people a few years ago that poor tenants in Raytown, Missouri could withhold their rent and go on rent strike, not for 1 month, not for 2 months, not for 3 months, but 4 months. And at the end of those 4 months, get to the bargaining table with their landlord and win rent reductions and new leases and a schedule for major repairs in their property. And telling the story of how we actually got to that victory is critical. And telling that story truthfully is also critical, right? So there's a sort of public way that we recognize and celebrate victories. And then we do a lot of deeper and very intentional training that allows the broader network of organizers we know to see under the hood a little bit and learn the ins and outs of what it takes to build that kind of power, the difficult moments, the major doubts and questions and tensions that we have to work through in order to make that happen. So it's not just about claiming victory and kind of flexing our power, but also about, really bringing in on the struggle required to win. But I do think celebrating victories and recognizing them in public is a huge part of the work we have to do in order to inspire other tenants to organize in difficult conditions. And the story that I just told you actually about the tenants in Raytown, that organizing was actually inspired by those tenants seeing the storytelling about tenants in Independence, Missouri, which is a sort of neighboring suburb of Kansas City that had been on rent strike for 8 months, and then they won. So these wins kind of stack on top of one another, but only if we do a good enough job telling the story and bringing people in, not just on, the big flashy victory, but all the work it takes to get there.
Is part of the storytelling also, in addition to explaining the victories and how they were won, does it also involve, at least to a mainstream audience, explaining and narrating the failures of capitalism? Because ultimately that's what it is, right? We live in a society where our housing is dependent on profit making for landowners, for property owners, and that's just accepted as normal. But of course, for people who are on the other end of it, it feels anything but normal. So does that storytelling also focus or need to focus on how really capitalism is the driver of this?
We do a lot of political education with our base about the market and how it works, how it came to be, who calls the shots, who has to deal with the consequences. I think for us, this work is based on interest, self-interest, and mutual interest among the various parties involved. It is not, I don't think it's a strong organizing tactic to be overly ideological, especially at the doors with people who are dealing with material hardships. It's important to talk to them about their immediate self-interest and organize initially around that interest. And the union serves as a vehicle for political education. So we've seen in very short order people come in to the union because their elevator is not working, and they may not think of themselves as a political person at all. They may not have strong ideology one way or another. And they come in because the elevator, and in the union, they get an education on the market and how it works and who calls the shots. And soon enough, they become really clear on the system. And many of our people have an intuition about the system and how it works and how it has not served them and who's benefiting. And the union, I think, is often a place that can equip people with an analysis and the language in order to further our collective strategies.
Going back to how the Tenant Union Federation works, on the one hand, you're mostly focused on getting to or collectively organizing and getting landlords to meet tenants where they're at and meet the demands of tenants. But what about federal housing policy or even state level housing policy, government housing policy in general? I mean, if governments regulated how much rent can be raised by, your job would be easier, right? Is that also something that Tenant Union Federation covers?
Yeah, absolutely. For many years, many of us have been advocating for universal rent controls, for accountability on bad actors who exploit the system as it exists, for the public provision of housing known as social housing, where the public sector plays a big role in not only producing but managing housing that's off of the private market and not available for speculation. So ultimately, I think there has to be a solution at a systems level that comes from the state in order to meet the scale of the need and in order to transform housing from commodity to public good. We're sort of organizing under conditions right now and during a political reality where that feels very far from where we are, but we are certainly organizing with that as the North Star, that meaning a more systematic approach to changing the conditions that our folks are left to live within.
When we think about the way in which housing organizing takes place, do you feel that there are natural allies that union tenant organizing has? I mean, I imagine traditional labor unions are among your allies. Who do you work with in the social justice universe in a way that furthers your goals?
Increasingly, we're partnering closely with organized labor. So I'm actually calling you from Minneapolis, where just yesterday, tenants across the Twin Cities launched a rent strike drive, and they did so in partnership with 5 labor unions. And that type of partnership is unprecedented. And organized labor, I think, is increasingly clear that in today's economy, a wage increase, for example, might as well be a direct transfer to our landlords. Many workers, even those with the strongest possible contracts and benefits, are really struggling because of the housing market and the way that their homes have been commodified. So increasingly, we're finding allies in organized labor and across a bunch of other sectors as well. I think some of the uniqueness of tenant organizing and worker organizing is that we're able to organize across a lot of the lines that the other side might use to divide us, across race, across age, across gender, across geography, even across class. And that puts us in a strong position to build a really large tent. And in many instances across the country, that's exactly what you see in tenant unions is a room full of people who no one would really expect to be in deep partnership together. But the sort of basis of their tenancy binds them together, and increasingly they're starting to identify with one another and across this kind of tenant class.
Tell me more about the Minneapolis rent strike. That sounds really exciting. I imagine that has something to do or intersects in some way with the organized resistance to federal agents on the ground there.
Yeah, it's completely connected to it. So, as you know, Minneapolis and St. Paul have been under siege, and this federal occupation is nearing 3 months long. And the community here has both endured a lot and resisted in extraordinary ways. And part of that resistance has looked like organizing at the property level, the block level, the neighborhood level. And a lot of that organizing resembles the type of tenant organizing that we are trying to propagate and we would like to see everywhere in the country. So it's in the midst of this federal incursion that tenants across the Twin Cities have launched a Twin Cities tenant union that was just at the end of last month. And just last weekend, we had our first meeting of Twin Cities tenants. And just yesterday, we launched a rent strike drive. This is not a rent strike, but it's us assessing our readiness to go on strike on March 1st. And the reason for this is that there are many, many tenants who cannot pay their rent right now because they've been forced to hide at home while federal agents have roamed the streets. And this is a totally unreal, unimaginable situation that requires a state-based solution. There's no GoFundMeing our way out of this crisis. And that's even, a couple months into this extraordinary effort on behalf of the community to support the people who are the most vulnerable during this time. People have, gone to extreme lengths to ensure that people can pay rent and that their neighbors are fed and kids are taken to school. And the state cannot rely on the goodwill of everyday people to close a gap that's this significant. So it's well past time for a state-based solution, and that's what the strike drive is trying to help orchestrate. It's, the latest example of the people of Minneapolis and St. Paul fighting and caring for one another.
It's quite remarkable. I mean, I've been certainly monitoring all of the ways in which people have been engaged in mutual aid, raising money for rental assistance for families whose main breadwinner was disappeared by ICE or have been unable to go out to work for fear of being dragged away by ICE. But yeah, crowdfunding can only last so long. It's simply not sustainable. Well, finally, how can people get involved with the work of Tenant Union Federation? What is the way in which folks can, I mean, imagine that you have to first get organized, or can individuals just reach out to you, maybe find out when that next union school is happening? And also, if they want to financially support and show solidarity, what can they do?
The best place to start is tenantfederation.org. We've got an interest form where groups of tenants who are trying to organize in their property across their cities or towns can reach out, and we'll get everyone who signs up for that list the information on our upcoming trainings. We don't relate as deeply with individuals. I think this is actually an important part of our strategic practice, is that we are most deeply invested in training groups of people in their properties or across their cities. It's not an individual membership organization, and that's not because we don't, love and support individual tenants who are trying to organize, but it's because we need to be really deliberate about investing in, burgeoning power bases that are organizing in the way that we've seen be the most powerful across the country. So that doesn't mean that we need, majorities before we engage, but we definitely encourage tenants to start building with at least a handful of their neighbors and then get involved with our trainings from that point, because very quickly it can build beyond that.
And we'll post a link to that website from our site later as well. Tara, thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck to you.
Thanks so much.
My guest has been TaraRaghuveer, director and founder of the Tenant Union Federation, and this is Rising Up for Justice. I'm SonaliKolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of FreeSpeechTV and subscribers of my long-standing program Rising Up with Sonali. Find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.